Fargo, the new virtual assistant from Wells Fargo, makes banking faster and easier. Like this.
Fargo, what's my checking account routing number?
And this.
Fargo, turn off my debit card.
And this.
Fargo, what did I spend on groceries last month?
And that's just the beginning. Do you, Fargo? You can. In the Wells Fargo mobile app. Learn more at wellsfargo.com/getfargo.
Terms and conditions apply. Your mobile carrier's availability and message and data rates may apply. Wells Fargo Bank, N.A., member FDIC.
So our podcast is called Right and Wrong.
Are these your notes?
These
These are your notes about what we're going to say?
Anything.
Nailed it.
It's the short answer.
So how many novels did you not finish?
Oh my God, so many.
It was perfect. What's she talking about? This is nonsense.
Ooh, a spicy question. I love it.
This is it, guys. The big secret to getting published is you have to write a good book. You heard it here first. Hello, and welcome back to the Right and Wrong podcast. On today's episode, I am joined by Scottish writer who has just published her debut novel, Clytemnestra's Bind, the first book in a 3-part epic series based on Greek mythology. It's Susan C. Wilson. Hi, welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Great to have you on. Let's kick off with the book, which will be out as of this airing. Clytemnestra's Bind, what's it all about?
So it's the story of Clytemnestra, which she relates herself in the first person. It's written as historical fiction, and it's set firmly in the Greek late Bronze Age. So Clytemnestra's world turns upside down when Agamemnon invades her palace. He destroys her family, and he claims not just the throne, but Clytemnestra herself. She vows to avenge her dead by killing Agamemnon, but she quickly becomes pregnant by him with her first daughter Iphigenia and then with Electra. So she faces a dilemma. If she avenges her dead, which is a sacred duty as well as her desire, what will happen to her children? Agamemnon is the most powerful king in the land, and he's also ruthless and untrustworthy. So will her children be safer with him alive, or will they be less safe? And if she fails in the attempt to kill him, what will happen to her children? So, and then, of course, there's a familiar part of the story when Agamemnon turns his attention towards the wealthy citadel of Troy, and his ambitions threaten even more starkly to destroy Clytemnestra's family. Yes.
Gosh, Greek mythology is just non-stop drama, isn't it?
It is. It's non-stop drama. That's why I love it.
And am I right in thinking that you've always been fascinated by ancient mythology?
I have, yeah. First discovered ancient mythology when I was a child, just leafing through my mum's dictionaries and encyclopedias, and I stumbled on all these names, and I just became absolutely fascinated with the stories and all the connections. And I even, at one point, attempted to write my own Greek mythology dictionary when I was about 9 or 10. I didn't realise you could buy such a thing, so I attempted to write my own one, complete with lavish illustrations, and it just quickly became a mess because I kept discovering yet more connections and more characters.
Yeah.
So I ended up very much out of order. But yeah, I've just always been fascinated.
Okay. So this is the first book in your House of Atreus. Is it Atreus? Series?
House of Atreus.
This is the first book in the series, and like there's a lot of Greek mythology to choose from. What was it about these characters and the kind of these events that really drew you in?
It has always struck me that the ancient Greeks blamed Clytemnestra for killing her husband, which she did to avenge his murder of her child, whereas they didn't blame Agamemnon at all. Sometimes Clytemnestra garnered a sliver of sympathy, but it was always followed by condemnation of her as a supposedly monstrous woman, because she was a woman who rebelled against her husband, her master, and she committed the ultimately wicked female crime of killing him. But I don't understand how anyone could at least fail to at least pity the predicament that she was in. But of course, I suppose the life of a daughter and the grief of a mother were outweighed by male concerns. In this case, Agamemnon's desire to wage war against Troy, which he could only do by sacrificing his daughter to the goddess Artemis. But the House of Atreus as well, there are so many stories going back even further than Clytemnestra and Agamemnon. So there's just so much meat that I could get from this. That's really what attracted me to the House of Atreus.
I'm not too familiar with the mythology around that, but am I right in thinking that at some point Atreus, who was Agamemnon's father, did he feed his nephews to his brother at one point?
He did, yes, yeah, and that features in my story.
Okay.
It features because there's a whole backdrop of various murders that went on prior to Clytemnestra coming into the story, and just appalling treatment of the children in the House of Atreus, and it all features in the story.
Okay. So mythological retellings, I would say in many ways are probably more flexible than maybe like a straight historical fiction taken from a snapshot in time, because the fact that they are mythological sort of anyway, you know that there's elements that aren't exact. But I think it's still important to have an understanding of where it all came from. And by the sounds of it, it sort of sounds like you've been researching for this your entire life. But was there a lot of research involved when it actually came to sort of putting it all together?
Yes, lots and lots of research for the mythological elements, and also for the Bronze Age setting as well, because I very much am telling this as historical fiction.
Okay.
So, in terms of the mythology, I've obviously researched the original sources. I say original sources, but the myths, as they've come down to us, there were so many different versions of these myths, and the ones that have come down to us are really the surviving version. People kind of think of them as the final versions, but there were so many different ones. Yeah, so I researched those. I've researched just basically everything I could get my hands on in terms of Greek dramas, the ancient Greek writers, in terms of the history, the Bronze Age. I read lots of books and continue to read lots of books on the Mycenaeans, on Mycenae, also Homer and classical Greece as well.
Oh, wow. So you really you sort of did the research that was necessary for this, and then sort of read around the topic as well.
Yeah.
Okay, that's great. So that you can sort of stretch in where you need to kind of stretch into different things and kind of reference different things.
Yeah.
Amazing. So moving on to some more sort of publishing-y sort of some stuff now. You are with Neem Tree Press. Do you have a literary agent, or did you submit directly to them?
I submitted directly to them. So I had attempted to, after I finished writing Clytemnestra's Bind, I approached a number of agents. I didn't keep a tally because that would just be depressing. But I spent about maybe a year trying to get a literary agent, and it's such a slow process, and maybe I was a little bit impatient, I don't know. But I then decided that I was going to submit to publishers directly. So I got a hold of, obviously you can't submit to the big publishers directly very often, there's hardly ever open windows, but I got a hold of a book called Myslexia's Independent Press Guide, which was fantastic. It's absolutely fantastic. And I discovered the various different independent presses that I could submit to. So when I started doing that, I got a lot more interest than through the agents, and I was offered a contract by another publisher, which I turned down, and there was quite a bit of interest from various publishers. But then I submitted to Neem Tree Press. That was actually in 2020 that I submitted to Neem Tree Press.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And at that point, I knew that I'd find my publisher.
So before you said you'd submitted to lots of agents and things, had you sort of workshopped the manuscript and done sort of critique with different people before you submitted it? I
did back in the early days. So there's been quite a big history, if you like, with this manuscript. I started it actually in 2011, which is frightening. That's frightening. But I haven't worked on it all that time. I started it in 2011, and back then I had a critique group, which I think it's massively important to have people reading your book, especially in kind of early stages. It's really important. So I had a fantastic little critique group back then, and I worked on it for about a year and a half, maybe 2 years, which, yeah, it's quite a long time. But then I put it aside and I actually worked on the Helen book, which is the second book in my trilogy. I worked on that for a while, put that aside. I put books aside, but not because I don't intend to come back to them. It's just the way I work. So I put that aside as well, and I worked on yet another book, which was nothing to do with Greek mythology. It was a political satire. And then I took a wee break from writing for a while. Then I went back to Clytemnestra, and by that stage I wasn't actually in a critique group, but I think I'd benefited so much from it already. And then I began submitting.
Okay. And you eventually decided to go with Neem Tree Press, who you seem very happy with. Are you in, now that you have like the book deal, and it's a 3-book deal, right?
Yeah.
Are you interested at all in looking for an agent, working with an agent now, or are you happy just working directly with the publisher?
I think because I've signed these, it wasn't actually a 3-book deal. It was 3 separate contracts, but
okay,
splitting hairs there. But because I've already signed those 3 contracts, I don't know what the value would be right now in bringing in an agent. But afterwards, then I think I would be keen to get signed up. But Neem Tree Press have done so much in terms of publicising the work. So yeah, but later on, I think I would maybe like to bring an agent in if I could.
Okay, so you've got a little bit of time while you put these books out to sort of think about it and maybe like look at your options and things like that, see how it's going. Yeah. And you mentioned that the second book was it called Helen?
It's now called Helen's Judgment.
Helen's Judgment. And I'm assuming this is Helen of Troy.
It is, yes. Yeah. So she's, how did you guess? She's Clytemnestra's sister. And yeah, it just seems like I'd actually started writing that book first originally before Clytemnestra, but it makes sense to have that book as the middle book now.
Okay. So the series is going to be sort of head hopping between the sort of women of the family. Yeah, so the second book, Helen, and also Achilles. Achilles actually narrates the story from, I'm bringing in a wee bit the supernatural, which isn't really in my first novel, but Achilles is actually narrating the novel from Beyond the Grave in the second book. Because in the Iliad, he wasn't just a warrior, he was a poet, a bard as well. So I thought it'd be quite interesting to bring him in as a sort of all-knowing narrator. And because the Helen story is Trojan War is such an epic story, I wanted to tell it from more than one perspective, but it does very much concentrate on Helen though. Okay. And then the third book is Electra. So Electra's Fury, which actually is Electra, who is Clytemnestra's daughter, and Hermione, who is Helen's daughter. So it's kind of exploring their fraught relationships with their mothers. Oh wow! Okay, this sounds really interesting way to kind of tell one long story, but then from different points of view. That's great.
Yeah. I prefer to do that rather than pack everything into the one novel. I think it's more satisfying to, read it across several novels.
Yeah. And
hello, saver. Whether you're saving for that trip to the tropics or saving for an emergency, now is the time to take advantage of Wells Fargo's savings options. Wells Fargo offers savings accounts that can help you save towards your goals. So, what are you saving for? Visit a Wells Fargo branch or wellsfargo.com/save to open a savings account today.
Wells Fargo Bank, N.A., member FDIC.
So currently working on book 2. Many authors say that the second book is a very different experience to the first book. It sort of comes with a host of different challenges. Have you figured out a good routine, like a good scheduling kind of system for your writing and editing?
Well, so the second book was actually originally the first book, but now that I am, in the process of publicising the first book, I am kind of struggling a little bit to get time to work on the second book. I'm so glad that it is already in the editing stage, because if it was still in the writing stage, the first draft stage, I would be panicking a little bit.
Oh yeah, of course.
But I work full time, quite a demanding job. I'm quite tired in the evenings. So a lot of my publicising is done at the weekend. And so I'm kind of struggling for time a little bit. But I'm hoping that when we get I'm hoping that maybe in the next few weeks, things might have calmed down slightly with the publicising, and then I can concentrate a bit more on editing Helen. But I am just so glad that it's already in quite a reasonable state at the moment.
That's great. You really set yourself up to be in a good position with that.
And Electra's in first draft as well.
Okay, so are you kind of simultaneously also trying to start getting Electra done?
Yeah. So it's not so much simultaneously, but I've had the leisure before signing up to Neem Tree Press. I had the leisure to put things aside, and that's kind of what I like to do. I like to write a first draft and put it aside and come back to it a while later after I've worked on something else. I like to come back to it with fresh eyes. Yeah. And I don't know if I'll always be able to work that way, but when you don't have the time pressures for getting the next book written, then it's possible just to put things aside for a year or 2 years or whatever, then come back to them. Yeah.
And are you working with the same editor that you worked with the first book?
So I haven't worked with the editor yet for Helen or Electra. Okay. The first editor, I'm not sure, because they've actually just taken on a new editor who's actually locally based for me, so that's great. I'm going to meet her shortly. So. Oh, okay. So it'll be a different editor. I suspect it will be a different editor. Yeah.
Okay. How do you feel about that?
I'm fine. Yeah, good. I mean, Clytemnestra didn't really require much editing anyway, because I'd worked on it so much that really it was a lot of commas got added. Basically, was
always commas.
Always lots and lots of commas. That was basically the main part. There wasn't any major changes. There was one scene that had to be reduced to a couple of paragraphs. It was a scene that it drew a parallel with the House of Atreus story. It was later on in the book where a couple of petitioners are telling their story to Clytemnestra, and it drew parallels, but it was also meant to be some comic relief. So I don't know whether that was entirely appropriate in a book like Clytemnestra's Bind as well, but it was meant to be a bit of relief from all the high drama, but that ended up getting reduced to a couple of paragraphs. So, but there wasn't an awful lot of editing, so it might be a bit different when it comes to Electra, because it's going to be I'm not going to have edited it myself quite as much as I've done with Clytemnestra prior to handing it over.
Yes. Yeah. But in another way, when books are in earlier stages and you're working with the editor at an earlier stage, there's probably going to be less editing later on anyway, because two heads working together and stuff. Yeah,
I am actually really looking forward to that. It'll be a very different process. It might be a lot quicker.
Yeah. Well, I know from my friends who are authors and have one or two books published, that the process does change a lot in terms of there's a lot more sort of like drafting ideas and sort of writing up a few chapters and then bouncing that between agents or editors or whoever it might be, and then either like completely reshaping that or things like, I guess similar to like you were saying with critique groups, but I think a little bit more kind of flexible.
Yeah. I'm actually really looking forward to that, to see how it changes the editing process. Yeah.
So you've got the 3-part trilogy, and it sounds like you have always been and continued to be fascinated by Greek mythology. After this, will you do more Greek mythology? Maybe pick a different like time or characters?
Yes, yeah, I will. I've put so much research into it, and to be honest, I don't really do things by half. So if I was to move on to a different mythology, maybe Norse or something like that, then I would have to do lots and lots and lots of research. So yeah, I'm going to stick with the Greek mythology. It's going to pay off because I've spent so much money as well on all the books, and it's going to pay off.
Okay. Are there any like certain characters or stories that you have your eye on?
Maybe.
Okay, top secret.
Maybe.
Amazing.
I might delve a bit further back in time, I think.
Okay. I mean, there's a lot of time to play with when it comes to Greek mythology.
Yeah.
So, as of this airing, the first book will be out in the world. Through that experience of not only writing it, but then also like submitting and eventually working with Neem Tree Press, what have you learned through the experience of that first book that you think is going to really help you out going into the second book?
That's quite hard to say because I am actually already so far into the second book.
That's true.
Anyway, I've edited it a couple of times already. It's gone through quite big changes because when I first started on it, that was before I discovered critique groups. And, it has gone through some quite major changes anyway.
It sort of sounds like your second book is kind of more like the experience of a first book because you didn't edit the first book too much because it had been worked on so long.
Yeah, it is kind of like that. I've written things in the past as well, but never particularly seriously.
Yeah.
Never really with a view to getting published. But yeah, I think I wrote my first book when I was 21.
Okay.
And it was just a pile of rubbish. It really was. It was just a test of stamina to see if I was capable of sitting down and writing a book, but I never really tried to get that published.
Yeah, I think that's true of so many people and writers. I mean, I remember the first thing I wrote, and I did make the mistake of trying to get it published and things, and it was rightfully rejected by everyone. But it sounds like you're in a kind of interesting and somewhat unique position where your first book didn't get that. You didn't have too much editing because it was very long. The process you've done so many drafts of it, thus making your second book a more similar experience to most people's experience with their first book, probably.
Yeah,
so your
probably.
third book, which you're excited for, because then you're going to work.
It's going to be rather different.
Stage. Yeah, that's going to be your
like my second book.
Yeah, kind of.
Yeah, I think so. And I'll have much more of a clue as well about how much publicity and publicising is involved as well, which I didn't have much idea about with Clytemnestra's Bind. I knew it'd be quite intense, but yeah, it is quite intense.
It's good though. That's good. It's good
great.
to be busy and to be doing lots of publicity and things like that. So all good. As always, proving that everyone's writing journey and when you go through publishing is entirely unique, because I think your experience is going to be so different to everyone else's.
Okay. I think that's a good thing, maybe.
Yes, maybe. I think it is. It's one of the things that I love about this industry is that no two writers have the same journey. It's all unique, and there's no sort of one correct way of doing it. Everyone gets into it and gets through it has their own path.
Yeah.
And I think that brings us on to what is always the final question. So, Susan, if you were stranded on a desert island with a single book, which book would it be? So,
of course, I knew this question was coming up, and I've tormented myself. I've absolutely tortured myself. I was thinking about cheating. I've got this huge omnibus of Muriel Spark, but I suppose I can't really get away with that.
Well, a lot of people have. Someone found a bound copy of all 3 Lord of the Rings books.
Oh, okay.
And they literally sent me the link on the internet to prove that it existed.
But was the Lord of the Rings, wasn't it originally a big, massive single book anyway, and he split it into smaller books, The Fellowship of the Rings and what have you? I think so. I could be wrong.
It's just enormous as one book there.
It is, yeah. Well, but I decided though on Wuthering Heights because it's just the one book that I really could get to the end of it and go straight back to the beginning quite happily. I've read it so many times, and the weird thing about that is it never actually changes for me. It's always the same every single time I read it, and yet I can read it over and over and over.
Yeah,
I think the only time that it changed for me was my second reading, because I read it first when I was 14 and I kind of romanticised Heathcliff for some bizarre reason. So the second time I read it, I thought, whoa,
yeah,
he's actually quite a terrible person. But I just love it. I love its the setting, I love the characters, I love the kind of darkness of it, and I love my conflicted feelings for Cathy and Heathcliff as well. Pity Heathcliff when he arrives as a child at the Heights, and then of course he turns into this terrible person, inflicting his vengeance on people who just don't deserve that treatment. But yes, it's just such a great book.
It is. It's a classic, and I always say, these books are classics for a reason.
Absolutely.
It's funny because there's definitely a mentality, and I'm guilty of this as well, as where I have this massive to be read pile, and then there's I also sort of have a sort of off to the side, I have like a classics I should read pile, and I'm always like, and I've spoken to other people who have a similar kind of energy to this, and they're always like, oh, I just want to read the new thing though, and then when they do eventually get around to reading a classic, they're like, oh my god, this is amazing.
Yeah, no, I absolutely love classics. I would actually rather be reading classics than new things, but there's a reason why books are still being read
exactly
100 plus years later. There's a very good reason. Yeah,
I'm always blown away whenever I read like an old classic or even a modern classic, and I'm like, wow, I get it. I get the hype.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yep.
Amazing. Well, thanks so much, Susan, for coming on and telling us all about your new book and all the mythology and everything that goes behind it, and your publishing journey. It's been really interesting chatting with you.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I've really enjoyed it.
And for anyone wanting to keep up with what Susan is doing, you can follow her on Twitter at Bronze Age Woman. That's WMMIN. Or on her website, you can find out more at www.susancwilson.co.uk. To make sure you don't miss an episode of this podcast, follow along on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, or Facebook, and you can also support the show on Patreon. For more bookish chat, you can check out my other podcast, The Chosen Ones and Other Tropes. Thanks again to Susan, and thanks to everyone listening. We'll catch you on the next episode.